The glass slipped from Petra Wynn's fingers before she could catch it. It didn't shatter. The carpet in the private dining room of Holbrook House was thick enough to swallow the sound. But the sparkling water it held spread in a dark, quiet bloom across the ivory wool, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. She was already crouching, already pressing a cloth napkin against the stain, when the woman's voice came down on her like a blade. "Do you have any concept," said Claudia Remington Shaw, not bothering to lower her voice, "of what that carpet cost?" Petra kept her hands moving. She didn't look up. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, I'll have it treated right away." Treated. The word landed like a small, controlled explosion. "You'll have it treated. Do you understand this is a Restoration-era wool carpet? From a mill in Scotland that no longer exists." There were 12 other guests at the long table. Petra could feel their attention shifting, the particular kind of silence that falls when people are grateful not to be the one being spoken to. She pressed harder on the napkin and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She needed this job. Holbrook House was a private members' club in downtown Toronto. The kind of place where the membership fees were never discussed openly, where the dining room had no menu posted, where the staff were expected to be invisible until they were needed. Petra had been working the private events floor for 7 months. She was good at being invisible. She'd had practice. But then the little girl spoke. She was sitting one seat down from Claudia Remington Shaw, close enough that Petra had assumed she was the woman's granddaughter. She couldn't have been older than 6. She had dark hair pulled back unevenly, the way a child's hair looks when no one's had time to fix it properly, and she was wearing a dress with a small blue collar that was slightly askew. She'd been very quiet through the dinner. Petra had noticed her the way she noticed most things, peripherally, automatically, cataloguing without meaning to. The little girl looked at Petra on the floor with the napkin, and then she looked at Claudia Remington Shaw, and she said, in a very small voice, "She didn't mean to." The table went quieter, if that was possible. Claudia Remington Shaw turned her head slowly toward the child. "I beg your pardon?" She didn't mean to drop it. The girl's chin was trembling slightly, but her eyes were steady. It was an accident. The woman's expression didn't change exactly. It just cooled. The way a room cools when someone opens a window in November. "Children," she said, "who are brought to adult dinners are expected to behave like adults, which means they do not interrupt." The little girl flinched. It was small, barely visible, but Petra saw it because Petra was close to the ground and close to the child, and she had spent enough years watching people for the tiny signals that told you when to move and when to stay still. Something in Petra's chest went tight. She stood up. She didn't plan it. She would think about this later, lying awake in her apartment on Bloor Street, staring at the ceiling with her uniform still half on, and she still wouldn't be able to explain the exact moment she decided. It wasn't a decision, really. It was more like a reflex. The same reflex that had made her step between her younger brother and trouble more times than she could count, back when they were small and their mother was sick, and the world seemed to be made almost entirely of sharp edges. She stood up with the damp napkin in her hand, and she said, quietly but clearly, "She's right, it was an accident, and I'll take full responsibility for the carpet." Claudia Remington Shaw looked at her, really looked at her maybe for the first time, the way people look at furniture when it unexpectedly speaks. "Excuse me, the carpet responsible. I'll arrange for the cleaning service tonight and the cost will come from my pay." Petra kept her voice steady. But the little girl was only being kind, and she didn't deserve to be spoken to that way. The silence was different now. Heavier, more interested. Claudia's face had gone very still. "You," she said, "are going to want to be very careful about your next sentence." Petra said. And she did know. She knew exactly what she was risking. She'd done the math in the half-second before she opened her mouth, and she'd done it again as the words were coming out, and the answer was the same both times. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She had rent due in 11 days. She had her brother Wyatt's physiotherapy appointments to cover. She had a mother whose prescriptions weren't fully covered under the plan, and who never complained about it. Which made it worse. She knew all of that. She still didn't sit back down. The little girl was looking up at her with an expression Petra would remember for a long time. Not relief, exactly, and not gratitude. More like recognition, the look of someone who has been hoping for something and has learned not to expect it, and who is now not quite sure what to do with the fact that it happened anyway. Petra gave her the smallest possible nod. Across the room, near the arched doorway that led to the members' lounge, a man was watching. She didn't know that yet. She was called into the events manager's office 20 minutes later, still in her uniform, still holding the ghost of the damp napkin in her fingers, even though she'd long since put it down. The carpet stain had been photographed, documented, reported. Claudia Remington Shaw had finished her dinner with the rigid composure of someone who intended to follow up on this, in writing, through formal channels, in triplicate. The events manager, a tired man named Gordon who had always been reasonably fair to Petra, looked at her with the expression of someone delivering a diagnosis they'd been hoping to avoid. "She's a platinum tier member," he said. "I know. One of the founding families. I know that too." He pressed his fingers against his forehead. "Petra, I like you. I think you do good work. But I have a phone call to make in about 15 minutes, and I need to know how to handle this." She looked at him. "I told the truth. I told her I was responsible for the carpet and I'd cover the cleaning costs. That's still true. It's not the carpet she's upset about. I know." Gordon looked at his desk, then at the window, then back at her, with the expression of a man who has been doing this job long enough to know that the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing. "Give me until morning," he said. She nodded and walked out. In the staff corridor, she leaned against the wall for a moment with her eyes closed. Her phone said it was 9:47 p.m. Wyatt had a physio appointment at 8:15 in the morning, and she still needed to figure out how to get him there. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the frustrating thing. They never shook until afterward. And she breathed in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts the way she'd taught herself years ago, and she thought, whatever happens, you did the right thing. She wasn't sure that would be enough. It rarely was. She was pulling on her coat in the staff room when the door opened. The man who came in was not someone who used staff entrances. That was the first thing she registered. Not his face, not his age, not the quality of his coat, but the fact that he moved like someone who had never in his life been required to enter a room through a side door, and who had just chosen to do so anyway. He was in his early 50s, maybe, dark hair with grey at the temples, a suit that was the kind of expensive that stopped trying to show off. He paused when he saw her, as though confirming he had the right person, and then he crossed the room toward her at an even, unhurried pace. "Miss Wynne," he said. She had no idea how he knew her name. "Yes, my name is Rafferty Sterling." He said it plainly, without the slight pause and upward inflection that people used when they expected to be recognized. "The girl at the table tonight is my daughter. Her name is Hawthorne." Petra looked at him. "She goes by Thorne," he added, and something in his expression shifted briefly, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, something private. She decided when she was 4 that Hawthorne was too many syllables for daily use. Petra didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "Is she all right?" Something moved behind his eyes. "She is," he said. "She's been asking about you, about me. She wanted to know your name. She wanted to know if you were going to get in trouble." He paused. "I told her I was going to find out." Petra looked at her coat, half on, one arm through. She felt suddenly very aware of how tired she was, and how much was riding on the phone call Gordon was going to make in the morning, and how strange and disproportionate this entire conversation already felt compared to the size of what she'd actually done. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Whether I'm in trouble." "Claudia Remington Shaw is a significant member of this club," Rafferty Sterling said. "It wasn't a question. So I've been told. And you still said what you said." She met his eyes. They were dark and steady, and they were looking at her in a way that was direct without being intrusive, the look of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something, not perform the act of trying. "Your daughter defended me first," Petra said. "She's 6 years old. She thought it was unfair, and she said so, and then she got a lecture about how children at adult dinners should behave like adults." She paused. "I disagreed with that." A moment passed. "So did I," he said quietly. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a business card, plain white, minimalist, just his name and a number. He held it out. "Gordon Marsh will be receiving a call tonight," he said. "Not about this incident, about an event I'm planning for the spring. He's been trying to get my business for 3 years." He said it without any particular emphasis, the way you might mention that it looks like rain. "I'll leave it to you to decide what you do with this card." She took it. He held her gaze for one more moment, and then he said, "Thank you for what you did for my daughter. She doesn't forget kindness. She's had less of it than she should." He left. Petra stood in the staff room with the business card in her hand, and her coat half on, and her heart doing something complicated, and she thought about a lot of things. About Wyatt, about her mother, about the way Thorne had said she didn't mean to, with her chin trembling and her eyes steady, as though she had learned that telling the truth was something that cost you something. But you did it anyway. She put the card in her pocket and finished putting on her coat and went home. Gordon called her at 7:15 in the morning. She had been awake since 5:30, which was not unusual. "Come in at 10, he said, and his voice had the slightly stunned quality of a man who has had a significant telephone call the night before and is still processing the aftermath. "We need to talk." She dressed, got wired to his physio, sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes reading the same article about urban gardening in the magazine she'd picked up 3 times before, and then took the subway downtown. Gordon's office looked exactly the same as it had the night before, but Gordon himself looked like he'd slept slightly better than Petra had expected. He had coffee waiting. "Claudia Remington Shaw has submitted a formal complaint," he said. Petra nodded. "She's requesting a formal apology, a written statement of the club's conduct policy, and a review of the hiring standards for events staff." He picked up his pen and put it down. "She's also requested that you be removed from the events floor." Petra kept her face neutral. Her hands were under the table and she pressed them flat against her knees. "I also received a call at approximately 11 p.m. from a Mr. Rafferty Sterling." He looked at her across the desk. She said nothing. "He booked our grand ballroom for a corporate event in March. 350 guests. Full catering, private bar, valet." Gordon paused. He specified in the booking that the event coordinator should be you. The silence stretched. "That's not a position I currently hold," Petra said. "No," Gordon agreed. "It's not." He folded his hands on the desk. "The Remington Shaw complaint goes into the file. The Sterling booking is the largest single event contract we've closed in 4 years." He looked at her steadily. "I want to be clear that I'm not telling you what he said to me brought you out of consequences. What you said in that dining room it was more than you probably needed to say, and less than I would have liked you to say. And it was also—" He stopped, started again. "It was right. And I've been in this business long enough to know that those things don't always line up, and when they do, you try to remember it." Petra exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" she asked. "You're on events coordination from next week. Temporary, pending review." He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "And I'm going to need you to call Mr. Sterling's office to confirm the March details." She nodded. She thanked him. She walked out into the hallway and stood for a moment by the window that overlooked King Street, where the early October light was doing something very clean and honest with the glass office towers, and she pressed her forehead against the cool window and breathed. She called the number on the card 2 days later, because she spent the first day convincing herself it was a professional call and required no more thought than a professional call, and then she spent part of the second day acknowledging that she was wrong about that, and then she called. A woman answered, his assistant, sharp and efficient, and passed her through after confirming the name, and then Rafferty Sterling's voice was on the line. "Mrs. Wynne, Mr. calling about the March event. Gordon asked me to confirm the details." "Of course." There was a pause. "And are you still employed?" She almost laughed. "I am good." Another pause, shorter. "Thorne asked me to tell you that she hopes so." Petra was quiet for a moment. "How is she doing?" She heard him breathe. Not a sigh, exactly, but something that carried weight. "She's better, I think, than she was. She's been." He stopped. "She's been through some difficult things. Her mother passed away 2 years ago. She doesn't always have the language for what she's feeling, but she knew what it felt like when someone stood up for her." His voice was careful. "She talks about it." Petra looked at her desk. The small corner desk in the events office where she was now sitting, her name spelled wrong on a sticky note someone had left on the monitor. She thought about Thorne with her dark hair and her askew collar and her steadiness, the way she'd said she didn't mean to, as though telling the truth was a thing you did even when it was expensive. "She's braver than most adults," Petra said. "Yes," he said, "she is." There was a quality to the silence that followed that Petra paid attention to without being quite sure what she was paying attention to. They talked for 20 minutes about the March event. Catering preferences, accessibility requirements, sound setup, the specific request for no formal receiving line, because Mr. Sterling had always found them artificial. She wrote everything down in the clean, precise shorthand she'd developed over years of this work, and at the end he said, "I appreciate your time, Miss Wynne." And there was nothing unusual in that sentence, and she had no particular reason to replay it in her head afterward. She replayed it anyway. The autumn moved through Toronto the way it always did. Briefly, brilliantly, and then without warning into the grey that lasted until April. Petra coordinated 3 events in November, managed the Christmas function in December with a catering staff half depleted by illness, and somewhere in the middle of all of it stopped being surprised by the title on her temporary name badge. She saw Rafferty Sterling twice before the March event. The first time was at a club dinner in November, where he was a guest and she was managing the floor. He noticed her across the room, nodded once in acknowledgement, and that was all. But before he left, his assistant appeared with a small envelope that contained, improbably, a drawing. Thorne's drawing, done in coloured pencils of what appeared to be a waitress and a small girl, both of them with very large eyes and extremely yellow hair, regardless of their apparent actual hair colour, standing in front of what might have been a restaurant or might have been a castle. At the bottom, in careful block letters, "For Petra from Thorn." Petra put it on the wall above her desk, next to the sticky note with her name spelled wrong. The second time was in January, when he came to the club for a private lunch, and she was the one who greeted him at the door, because the front desk coordinator had stepped away, and Petra was passing through. He stopped when he saw her. "Mrs. Wynne, Mr. Sterling." He looked at the drawing above her desk, visible through the glass partition of the events office, and then back at her. And something about his expression was different from all the previous times she'd seen it. Less carefully maintained. "More human. She made you another one," he said. "I kept trying to send it and then felt absurd about sending a second child's drawing through a professional channel." Petra thought about the drawing on her wall. She thought about Thorn, who had started something in a room full of people who all stayed quiet. "You can send it," she said. "I'll put it next to the first one." His expression did the thing it had done when he'd mentioned that Thorn had decided Hawthorne was too many syllables. That brief, private shift. Something coming close to the surface and then settling back, but less far back than before. "How are you finding the new role?" he asked. "I'm good at it," she said. It was the most honest answer she had. "I know," he said simply. And then, "How is your family?" She blinked. She hadn't expected that. "My family?" "You mentioned. When we spoke on the phone, you mentioned a physiotherapy appointment." I assumed family. She hadn't mentioned it on the phone, she was almost certain. And then she thought back and realized she had, briefly, a footnote she'd offered as context for her schedule, and she was slightly startled that he'd retained it. "My brother," she said. "He's doing better. Thank you for asking." He nodded. There was a quality to the way he listened that was different from most people she met in this building. He listened without simultaneously preparing what to say next, and it made her feel in an odd way that she had his full attention without having to work for it. The front desk coordinator came back. The moment released itself naturally. "I'll see you in March," Rafferty Sterling said. "I'll be there," she said. The March event took 6 weeks of preparation and ran for one long, seamless Saturday evening that Petra spent mostly on her feet with a headset and a timeline, and the focused calm that came over her when there was a clear problem to solve and clear tools to solve it with. The catering was excellent. The sound was perfect. The 350 guests moved through the ballroom with the particular elegance of people who had forgotten they were supposed to be elegant. Rafferty Sterling spent most of the evening doing what hosts at these events did. Moving through the room, talking to everyone, being present. He was good at it. She watched him work the way she always watched a room she was responsible for. Analytically, efficiently, looking for problems and finding almost none. Near the end of the evening, around 10:30, when the formal program had wrapped, and the room had softened into the kind of loose, wine-warm conversation that meant everything had gone well, he appeared beside her. "Miss Wynne, Mr. Sterling, how are you finding it?" "Excellent," he said. "All of it." He paused. "Thorn is here, actually. She's in the lounge with my sister and approximately 4 desserts. She asked me to find out if you were the one who organized the flowers." Petra thought of the arrangements. Cream and sage green, simple, nothing excessive. "I chose them, yes. She says they look like something from a book she likes. She wanted you to know she approved." Petra smiled. She couldn't help it. "Tell her I'll take that as the highest compliment." He was quiet for a moment, standing beside her, both of them looking out at the room. "I'd like to thank you," he said. "Properly, I mean. Not through events, contracts, and drawings through assistance, though I recognize those are somewhat irregular forms of gratitude." He turned slightly toward her. "What you did that night, for Thorn, it wasn't a small thing. She carries it. She talks about it when she's trying to explain what it looks like when people are brave. She's 6 years old and she's already building a vocabulary for courage, and you're part of that vocabulary now." Petra looked at her timeline sheet, which she didn't need to look at. "She gave me the first example," she said. "She was the one who spoke up first." She was. He nodded. "And she needed to see someone follow. That's the part she talks about." The room hummed warmly around them. "She didn't have an easy second year," he said, and his voice was careful in the way voices got when they were carrying something heavy and trying not to let the weight show. "After her mother." She went very quiet. She stopped saying the things she was thinking. He paused. "She's been louder lately, in the way I always hoped she would be." Petra thought about a small girl in a restaurant with her chin trembling and her eyes steady, deciding that telling the truth was worth it even when it was expensive. "I'm glad," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that she was aware of it, and she met it, and neither of them looked away. "I'd like to ask you something," he said, "and you're completely within your rights to say no, or to tell me it's inappropriate, or to simply give me the extremely professional look you've been using on me all evening, which is very effective, and which I suspect you've been using since about 10 minutes into our first conversation." She considered this. "What would you like to ask? Whether you'd have dinner with me sometime. Not here. Not as a professional engagement." He paused. "As a question I'd like to know the answer to." She was quiet. The band in the corner was playing something low and unhurried, and the room smelled of good food and candle wax and the particular warmth of a gathered crowd of people who were, at least for this evening, glad to be in the same place. "You should know," she said, "that I'm going to check your record of calling me by my correct first name, because so far your average is not great." Something broke open in his expression, not the controlled, adjacent to a smile she'd seen before, but an actual, unguarded laugh, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Petra," he said, "would you have dinner with me?" She thought about Wyatt, who was walking better. She thought about her mother, who had called her last week to tell her that she was proud of her, which she never did unless she meant it. She thought about Thorne's drawing on her wall, 2 figures with improbably yellow hair standing in front of what might have been a restaurant or might have been a castle, and the fact that sometimes people started things without meaning to, and sometimes those things kept going in directions you didn't predict, and the question was whether you stayed still or whether you followed. "Yes," she said. Outside, Toronto was doing the thing it did in March. Not quite winter, not quite spring, the air sharp and clear and full of the particular promise of things that were about to change. Inside, the evening unwound gently toward its end, and Petra stood at the edge of a room she had built, and a conversation she had not expected, and felt, quietly, carefully, with both hands on the thing she was holding, something that might have been the beginning of something. It was enough to start.